turned a new leaf last week when we went from looking at the scriptures themselves to different ways of looking at different components of the scriptures. Like last week we looked at different individuals and how they play different roles to fulfill one part of God's plan of salvation, all the way back from Adam and Eve and to where Abraham was the first patriarch in God's plan to actively begin to have a nation of his own special possession, all the way up through Jesus laying the cornerstone and the apostles, the foundation, on up to the living church that we are today. And I want to look now at kind of the other side of the biblical looks, or the individuals, to look at the historical setting of any particular event in history at all. And I thought that it would be good to get us in perspective, since we're getting real close to season, to talk about college basketball. Now, the historical example laid over top, the historical method laid over top of a college basketball game. We have, for instance, two opposing fans get together to watch a game. What are the things that they agree upon? They agree upon things like the rules of the game, who's on which team, that there are two 20-minute halves separated by a halftime. There's a definite point that we both agree upon, and when the game's over, we agree that there is a way to know who won, and there's even rules for proper inflation of the game ball, which was in question a few years ago during the Super Bowl. Points of disagreement: fairness of the refs. When a foul has been committed, what kind of foul has been committed? Was it on purpose, or was it just throughout the course of the game? Whether a player should even still be in the game. Whether a travel was committed. Whether a player stepped out of bounds. Whether all the players, or some of the players, are even eligible to play college ball. You see, the ones that are points of agreements, these are indisputables. When the game's over, is when the clock runs out. We know who won by who had the most points. We know if two 20-minute halves have been played, a full game has been played. We know who's on which team by who showed up together in the same jerseys. Rules of play have been established by the NCAA. But all these other things on the other side, that's what we love to get together and fight about. IU versus UK, U of L versus UK, and all the other team rivalries that churn lots of dollars and emotions within families and within stadiums. These perspectives can offer two very different accounts of who should have won, what the score should have been. He should have still been in the game. He should have been the game's most valuable player. But these very different perspectives are accounts of the same event watched by two different people at the same time. While there are different historical perspectives, we usually give one that we call the authoritative one. In this case, it would be the referees, the ones who regulate the game all the way through, and at the end certify the results. Now, how does that have anything to do with what we're talking about?
Excuse me for just a second.
Staging a walkout. When we think about something like what we just talked about, and then the two different perspectives watching the same thing, they're watching something live as it happened. And then when the game's over, it's history. But when we talk about history, what do we mean when we say history?
Things in the past.
Things in the past.
Occurrences.
What was the other one?
Occurrences.
Occurrences. Any other ideas on what we would call just history?
We have important events and then less important events.
Okay, important events, less important events. Most people in here probably remember where you were at. I know it's been the recent question, do you remember where you were at on 9/11? Before that it was, do you remember where you were when the Challenger exploded? When, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, or when Pearl Harbor happened.
It was usually facts related to whatever that you're describing.
Okay, facts related to what you're describing. I tried to sit down on my own today and just come up with what should we call history, and because I thought about this a little bit. I'm not sure if this can be picked apart, or I probably can, but I came up with a factual and sequentially ordered events which can be placed on a timeline that may or may not be related or connected. And they could be anything from, like I said, the grand things that happen, like on 9/11, or things of that nature, which are probably still being studied and unfolded in some way, to what's a normal wake up routine for you to wake up to get out the door. You have a certain sequence of events, whether it's whatever those things are, in whatever order you go to get out the door. But the problem, or a problem that arises when we talk about history, not necessarily the personal history, like what do you do to have to get out the door, but things like the 9/11 or the basketball game, is when someone starts to comment on the facts, not just this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, but when you start to talk about cause and effect, this happened to cause this, or this happened which produced this effect, or whether there's enough similarities to suggest the two may be related or have a relationship, then you have a different perspective on what may or may not have occurred. This is even called historical perspective or perspectivism in the collegiate level. So who do we listen to? In the college basketball game, we listened to the refs because they were the recognized authority. Who gives us the authorized version today? How is it determined that he, she, or it, if it's a association or conglomeration of some sort, how is it determined that they should be the authority? And what do we do with competing views? I mean, for instance, we take history in school, however long ago it's been. I'm sure we all took history in school. But some of the things that you probably never heard were a Native American's account of the European invasion of the New World, a Japanese account of World War II and the dropping of the atomic bomb in Japan. You probably have never, well, here lately there have been more coming out, but years ago you probably never would have heard a Jewish account of life in Nazi Germany. Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, an account of life in the deep South of the Jim Crow era, written by 3/5 of a person. These are things you probably never would have heard of, but they're probably out there somewhere and in some way. They're coming to light more and more as historians. You discover more and more literature that were not necessarily authorized view of history. He's like I said, while these certainly would not have been the authorized version in our time, and maybe not even today's time, they're counted as a perspective as long as the factual events, not necessarily the commentary on them, closely resemble the authorized. That is, they give a similar account of a similar time from a different point of view. Sadly, the Bible does not just escape perspectivism either. And this is where we kind of broach into the historical method of the Scriptures. You see, neither the New Testament or the Gospels in particular. I want you to hear this closely. Neither the New Testament or the Gospels in particular contain historically reliable material. These are theological documents, and this theological purpose precludes the possibility of accurate historical data.
Who said? Where are you going with that?
This was the position. This was the position of the liberal German theological school,
Oh,
Tübingen, which produced all this radical stuff from the 19-teens all the way up even through to today, where we discount the Bible, where we chop up the Bible. Randy can't even hold it together back there. He's smiling pretty good about
I
that.
just thought Nancy was gonna jump up there in a minute.
But yeah, this is the history that's taught of the liberal schools, the liberal position schools where Scripture is not really Scripture and it's not reliable, and they use historical methods to chop it up. See, they presumed the bad kind of skeptical we've already talked about, where we don't just ask, what does this mean? They're asking, is this even really what it originally said, in a bad way, as to, did somebody completely rewrite this? Is this not only not the Scripture, but has it been significantly changed to where we can't even know what it originally said? That's the presumption they come to when they come to Scripture.
you mean like if somebody tried to change something in the Bible and tried to eliminate an event or something?
Well,
Well, they'd have thousands of manuscripts to have to erase. How logical is that?
well, it's not so much erasing as it is adding to. Like for instance, one of their big positions is that we can't hardly know anything about the real Jesus because the disciples and his followers added so much into there, like the miracles that can't have really happened, and things of that nature that are, like we said, outside the box. Once you start looking inside the box as the only possible thing, you discount things like his deity, miracles, things of that nature.
What's their basis for logic with that? Because if we believe the Bible is inspired, then you believe books on Abraham Lincoln, and they weren't there, and you don't just, maybe history is trying to be erased with our American history, but so many manuscripts that we have, we don't really know about, but you can't just erase it all, even if you wanted to add some to it. If it doesn't hold water with what the actual people that were there had to say. I don't like liberalism.
No. And where it all started, because you're asking how do they come to these ideas of coming to the Scripture like this, it's that same human philosophy that puts evolution above creation, because they can make it work by looking at the world. They don't have to have a creator. They can, in their mind, they can make it work looking at the world. Now they have to add in billions and billions of years that have pretty well proven that even with billions and billions of years, you don't get all this. It just doesn't happen by mistake, by accident, by incremental correct thing happening one time,
That's
one
why
thing at a
those-
time over thousands and thousands of years.
One of those plausible things, it's just not possible.
Mm-hmm. And they say because we don't have the original from the apostles' hand, is that it could have and likely did get added to, and Jesus was mythologized, and the miracles were added in, mythological type things, and like I said, this is their way of rationalizing based on the box, the created existence they can look out and see and touch and feel. And like I said, when you start discarding the things of God, the things of faith, that's all you end up with. See, modern historical reconstruction that's reconstruction. We weren't there. We have to figure out what happened. What happened in the first century with these Gospels, because we weren't there to see it. We have to take this information and we have to figure out what did and didn't happen, or what might have possibly happened. Modern reconstruction, it is called that because we weren't there for it, is carried out by inference, which sometimes requires imagination. And I pulled that from a scholarly journal, that quote right there, that this reconstruction requires inference and imagination.
Do these liberals, do they care enough about facts? Obviously, they're trying to disprove the Bible or do whatever they can to make it go away. But do they care enough to look back and see all the manuscripts that were brought together? Like the account of Jonah is mentioned in the book of Jonah, and then he's mentioned in the New Testament. Read in a wholly different time period. Do they look at those things?
I think they account for that to some degree.
Because I don't see how you can just blow that off.
Well, see, that's where they come back with their original statement that because these are theological, their writing was designed to build up the church. It wasn't designed to account for history. So if the church needed to write something to address an issue, it could do that, but that's not necessarily recording history. It's addressing an issue.
Yeah, just what you have on the screen there, if you think about it, we seek to determine the historical setting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's one thing, they destroy the historical setting
Mm-hmm.
with that reconstructionism. Same way with your last bullet there. What's the setting of the book? What's the place? Once you change that historical setting, then you come up with completely different conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make any sense?
It does. But these individuals, they can, they've got all sorts of things that they look at. It's here somewhere. Where's it at? Here we go. I thought I'd lost a paper, but I didn't. Here it is. Some of the things that they dispute. Because of millions and millions of years, yet the genealogies of Genesis only add up to 6 years, is a day in Genesis 24 hours? Or is a day some sort of allegorical thing that where day actually means a long period of undisclosed time? Because they need lots of time for evolution to work. Where did Adam's sons get wives? What is there proof of Noah's flood outside the Bible?
Take a walk up Hanover Hill and see the fossils.
Yep, exactly.
We do have some evidence.
Was Melchizedek a historical or a mythological figure? Because he's not recorded anywhere else. Moses is not mentioned anywhere outside of biblical literature. Neither are the events surrounding and including the Exodus, such as the plagues in the Red Sea. Did they even happen? The prolonged day in Joshua. The suggested possibility of multiple Daniels, Isaiahs, and Johns writing their respective books titled after them. These are some of the things that are attacked, because if they can do that, if they can attack the setting, the context, or even the person who is supposedly to have, written these things down, they can chip away at the historicity of the biblical narrative or the biblical text. And see, it's not that we shouldn't hear these things, but we should understand that even though we hear these things, the Bible's never been disproven. The Bible has never been shown to be wrong, and it's proven itself consistently over hundreds and hundreds of years. But in the historical method, as in now that we've looked at the negative side of those who try and attack the historical method, we can we can seek to determine the historical setting and context and importance of an event. The plagues and the Israelites in Exodus had a Pharaoh that decided not to honor the Israelites living in the land of Goshen and brought them in under slavery. Historical setting, God's people are no longer a prosperous group. They're brought in under slave conditions. So what does God do? He raises up Moses in a way that only he could. Raises him up. Pharaoh's daughter finds him, raises him up in the finest education in the world. Moses needs to get away because he killed an Egyptian. During that time, he learns how to listen to God. And then he leads the nation of Israel for the next 40 years. You see, what's the setting? The setting is Northern Africa, Egypt. What's the place in the life of the writer or history of the people? What's its place in the life of the writer? Moses is all over the place. I mean, he was a baby found in the river, raised in the finest schools. We think he may have possibly been in line to be, if not Pharaoh, definitely high in the next Pharaoh's court in his life. The history of the people. Well, Moses didn't really have a people. He killed an Egyptian, and he had to flee for his life. So he was a shepherd out in Midian. Then God called him back to his people. And Moses didn't want to go. He tried to find every reason in the world not to go. Why me? Who should I say that you are? How will they believe me? I'm slow of speech. Send my brother Aaron. No, you're going to go, but take him too. Is an example I'm going to read this right as it is here. If it is, for example, a writing of Paul, where does it place in his ministry? We're going to replace Paul with Moses. Where is Moses at in his ministry when he's in with the Exodus? Well, Moses is on the scene because he's alive in this. It's not Genesis, even though we know we're pretty sure Moses wrote Genesis. Moses is not in Genesis. But in Exodus, we see Moses. Moses is a a central figure in early Exodus, really all the way through Exodus. And he accounts for how God's people were finally released from Egypt. Moses is not only a first-hand witness of this, he's the active role in most of Exodus as God's spokesman, as God's instrument in the world against the opposition to his people. Now, if we seek to determine the historical setting of, let's say, another book, let's group a few books together. Let's say Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those are called the synoptics because they're so similar that they're almost synonymous with each other. They overlap in material quite a bit in several places, but they all record the life of Jesus. What is the setting of the book? Jesus had two major ministries. One of them was in Galilee. The other one is Judean ministry and Galilean ministry, which spanned about 60 miles. I think they're about 60 miles apart from each other. That's the entire range of Jesus' travels in ministry in his 3 years. 60 miles. So what is the setting of Matthew, Mark, and Luke? All three the same. What's the place in the life of the writer or the history of the people? Well, same Jewish people. But since then, there has been a captivity and a release and a restoration of Jerusalem. We've had the rise of these groups called the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Scribes. We've had political battles within those groups for power. But we still have a group collectively waiting for a promised Messiah from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. What is the place of the writer in the history of the people? Matthew was taken directly by Jesus when Jesus walked up to the tax booth and said, "Follow me." Mark, we believe, was a close associate of Peter. Also, we think he may be the same John Mark that had quite a bit of association with Paul. Luke had quite a bit of association with Paul, but he was a historian. All three wrote from different perspectives. Matthew was a Jew writing to Jews. Luke was a Gentile writing to Gentiles. Mark, we think, was writing from a perspective of almost like a military report. Mark's all about action. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Mark doesn't have a lot of flowery language. So it seems like he may have been writing a report, almost like for a Roman military type report. But when you think of the examples of Jesus' life, a lot of times today our historians will say, what about Jesus outside the Gospels? Is there any evidence for Jesus outside the Gospel? There are very few historians. Now, you'll always find one or two out on the fringe, just that want to be on the fringe. But it's hard to find a reputable historian who will say that Jesus did not live. Now, they'll debate all day long with you on, was he who he said he was, according to the Scriptures. But I brought in just one text here. I'm all about books. Jesus and the Christian origins outside the New Testament. There is outside evidence, outside the Bible, for Jesus. Not just some other Jesus, but Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of, born in a manger in Bethlehem, Jesus. But when we look at these sorts of things, we must ask ourselves the question, where does this all fit in? Well, if we look at back to Moses, for example, where does the Exodus fit in? How did they come to settle in the land of Goshen in the first place?
You asking us?
Yes, I'm always asking.
Well, they went down to Egypt first because there was a famine,
Mm-hmm.
and Joseph, who was their son that was given away or sold into the caravan, he raised up in Egypt, and he had so intelligent that he was like the second in command.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the brothers came to see if they could get food, he wiggled them to come down there, and then he exposed himself that he's the son or the brother.
Uh-huh.
And they were scared of him at first, but then realized that he was for their good. And so as long as that Pharaoh was alive, they prospered. Well, and God blessed them with
Mm-hmm.
growth and wealth. And then a new Pharaoh came about, and he didn't know about them and turned them into slaves.
Yes, they had several hundred years where they were
Right, for about 400 years.
430 years, somewhere in there, where they had, an amicable life in Goshen. Then a Pharaoh comes along that doesn't want to honor the deal of the past and enslaves them. The historical importance is that God's plan was never for them to stay in Egypt. Doctrinal contributions, we don't have doctrinal contributions here except maybe for Moses. When God calls or says to go, it's best not to fight God on it. Debate over canonicity in much of the Old Testament is no longer debated because the kid that found the Dead Sea Scrolls. Textual evidence as to what life was like at the time of the writing. Moses had it pretty good when he was among the Egyptians. But the Hebrews, not so much. The Hebrews were an enslaved people, and they were forced to do the work of slaves. Was the church, we didn't have the church at the time, we had the Lord's holy possession, His holy nation. Who were the powers in charge? We've talked about that already. What were the customs of the times? Basically, you worship Pharaoh. You worship Pharaoh, you worship the Egyptian gods, and the God of the Bible. All of his plagues specifically target the Egyptian gods. Now go back through that and we talk about the gospel narratives. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Where do they fit in? Matthew traveled with Jesus day in and day out. Mark and Luke, both close associates of apostles, had the information. May have been sitting right down next to one of them who was saying it out loud while they were writing it down. But whether or not this was the case, we know that they were well researched and that many of their accounts overlap. Now, a lot of times, the wrong side of historical perspectivism or historical criticism will say they copied off each other. They copied off each other. Now, we're not in 11th grade calculus class. Does it really matter if they copied off each other? It really doesn't matter if they copied off each other, but the fact is that even if Matthew and Luke may have copied off Mark, they greatly expanded and filled in and gave us a different perspective that would have been important to their intended or their targeted audience. Luke recorded things that would be important for the Gentiles. Matthew recorded things that would have been important for the Jews to have heard and to understand and to take into their thought and consideration. Historical importance, we have an account of Jesus. Not that he simply lived, but that he did all these things. He fulfilled all these things that were prophesied. You know, it's said that they're, depending on what counts as a prophecy to individuals, there's anywhere between 1 and 400 prophecies of Jesus in the Old Testament. Doctrinal contributions. Jesus completely returned over the religious world of the time when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. When he got up in the synagogue to read the scroll and said, I'm paraphrasing or trying to do a bad paraphrase, but yet in me this scripture is fulfilled today. And he got ran out over that. That was blasphemy. Debate over canonicity. I'm sure there's been some, but it's not been terrible from what I understand. A lot of it is whether or not they copied off each other and whether or not that's a problem. Doctrinal contributions. Jesus taught love, not acceptance by law. Textual evidence as to what life was like at the time of the writing. First century hadn't changed much over the years from the Old Testament. We had like I said, the rise, the Pharisees, the scribes, the Sadducees, different groups. We get to see them. We're introduced to them. We also see that they're the ones that Jesus has to battle against the hardest. We see that Jesus doesn't run to those who would be considered, the religious figures of the day. Jesus looks for those who want to sincerely follow him, who want to sincerely have forgiveness and to just follow the Lord. Was the church being persecuted at the time? Absolutely. The Jews tried to even squash the church before it even started, so much so that they had Jesus put on a cross. What were the customs of the time? Like I said, as far as daily life, it wasn't a lot different from the centuries past. We see in the parable of the coin that was found in the fish's mouth, you give to Caesar what is Caesar's. That's all the government was worried about, was getting the money from taxes. Don't start an uprising, pay your taxes, the government's good with you. The Jews were a little bit more concerned about religion and keeping their status and what they had going together. When we go to events, there we go. What we need to do when we look into things such as narratives or books that contain events and historical happenings, find out everything we can about the event. Who was involved? What was the nature of their character? When did it take place? What was the duration? We think about the 10 plagues, for instance. How long of a span of time did it take to do 10 plagues? I haven't looked this one up. I'm really asking. Probably more than 10 days. It probably took a little while. What was the nature of their character? They weren't just 10 random things. There was a specific reason for each plague. It was targeting each of a major god in Egypt. When did it take place? As soon as Moses said, let the people go, and Pharaoh said no, that's when God let it happen. What does the event place in the whole, where does the event place in the whole of the book? For Moses, it happens right when he takes leadership. Right when God says, go to my people, tell them I am sent you. And Moses hits the ground running, whether he wants to or not. Him and his brother Aaron. They go before the Pharaoh. They state their case. And they're rejected 10 times. But it is at the very beginning God gives Pharaoh the opportunity to let the people go. He gives him several opportunities to let the people go. Even at least once in there he says, okay, I'll let the people go, and then changes his mind. Why is it where it is? Because God gave Pharaoh a chance. Gave him 10 chances. God didn't just destroy Egypt. God didn't just send down the destroyer angels to just without any kind of warning or notice. He gave fair warning and fair chance. Let the people go. How does it contribute to the book as a whole? What happened at the end? They got to go. Except, Pharaoh wasn't saying, God wasn't saying, let the people go. Pharaoh was saying, these people got to go. Place it chronologically. It's easier to place the large sections together, like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, simply because Moses kind of encompasses all of those. But Exodus, though it was the beginning of the nation moving toward the promised land, it's the beginning of them having a leader that they could follow on earth. They had lived in Goshen for 400 plus years. I don't know what kind of community type structure, leadership type structure they had as a people in Goshen. But with Moses and Aaron, they had a point man. You look to Moses. Moses is going to lead you. Moses is going to guide you. Like we've said earlier, Moses was an individual like none other has ever been. He talked to God as any of us in here would talk to each other, as friends. What was the cause? It was the harsh oppression. I believe that God did not want for his people. What was the effect? Israel not only left Egypt, but they took the spoils of Egypt as well. Doctrinal contribution, I don't know that we have one here, except that when God says it, we better listen. Think about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Find out everything you can about particular events, objects that Jesus may talk about, the Good Samaritan, things that happened within that account. For instance, it's no small thing that when those who passed by the Good Samaritan passed by them on their way back from church. They didn't have to be ceremonially clean anymore. They could have touched him and helped him and had time to have become ceremonially clean again when it was time to go back to church again. They just passed him by because they just didn't want to deal with it. Things like paying, give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. They wanted to catch Jesus in... They wanted to put Jesus in a hard place, whether he was saying you don't pay your taxes, don't follow Caesar, where they could go reporting to Caesar and having him thrown in jail. He didn't do that. The woman caught in adultery. What did he say? You who are sinless, cast the first stone, because they wanted to catch him contradicting the law of Moses. Find out everything you can about an event. Who was involved? Every time Jesus had to have harsh words, or every time Jesus had to get contentious, a Pharisee was around, or a group of them, or the Sadducees, or a scribe, which was an expert in the law, would come along and try and pose a question like, what is the greatest commandment? What was the nature of their character? You see, once again, when Jesus had to be harsh and had to go up against some of these individuals, their character was not genuine. They had ulterior motives that Jesus could see coming a mile away. When did these things take place? Like the contentions that Jesus had with Pharisees and Sadducees, always in a group of people, always with several others around, because they wanted to do this in front of people to show them that Jesus was blaspheming God, or trying to have an uprising against Caesar by not paying his taxes or whatnot. Duration, we know that Jesus' ministry was about 3 to 3.5 years before he went to the cross. Where does the event take place in the wholeness of the book? Well, we know that the Gospels all record Jesus' life and active ministry. So if you count the time of Jesus, as an infant and as a boy, all the way through to the end of his ministry, possibly 33 years, 32, 33 years. But if you just count his active ministry, 3.5 years. Why is it where it is? You think about the Gospels being at the front of the New Testament. It makes sense, doesn't it? Jesus is the beginning of the church. It should be right there at the beginning. Do you also think about, until he died on the cross, everything up until that point, even everything in Matthew and Mark and in Luke, still Old Testament. Because he had not died for the sins of all, once for all. So it's fitting that they're at the front. It would even be fitting, even if they were after Malachi, at the very end of the Old Testament. We don't do that, but it would be fitting that they would be right in there. How do these events, or these books, contribute to, we'll say, the Bible as a whole? Well, God doesn't just drop a name on us and say, Jesus is my son, the sins are now forgiven, follow him. No other information. We have a figure who historically lived, who preferred the Son of Man, actively cast his lot with man, was not a ghost or a phantom, he was flesh and blood, somehow still retained deity, lived this life tempted in every way that we are, went to the cross and died a perfect sacrifice for all of us. And we have 4 different accounts of it. 4 different accounts of individuals we know were very closely associated with him. Not someone who just decided they were going to write a book and sell it. So we find out everything we can. Find out who was involved. Jesus also had 12 disciples. One of them even defected at the end. When did that take place? Well, the disciple defected when Jesus said, one of you will betray me, and it's that one right there. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was in that position and you were in the presence of Jesus, and he says, you are going to betray me. I would find every way in the world for that to not happen. But somehow, Judas fulfilled that prophecy. Where does the whole of the book take place? We know that it takes place in the areas where Jesus was active in his ministries. How does it contribute to the Bible as a whole? It gives us a picture of Jesus and who he is. Place it chronologically, like I said, it could just as easily, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John could just as easily be the last 4 books of the Old Testament. What was the cause? Because he was the prophesied Messiah, the one who had actually come. What was the effect? The whole world was turned right side up, potentially, for all who would obey the gospel, for all who would come to him for salvation. And that's the doctrinal contribution, is that it's no longer the law of Moses that the Pharisees and the rabbis of the time wanted to continue to force and push on the people. It wasn't even some sort of weird mixing of Christianity with Judaism that they tried that. The Pharisees tried that too when they saw Christianity wasn't going away. It was that Judaism, following the law of Moses, rather, fulfilled its purpose in time. But the more perfect came along, the perfect one came along and set aside the punishment of the law and gives grace instead. And these same kinds of things that we've talked about can be performed on any historical book. I picked Exodus out at random. We could talk about Joshua just as easily. We could talk about Ruth just as easily. Talk about the Apostle Paul and some of his writings just as easily. But it's important that when we start with historical perspective, that we don't derail into the, did this even happen? It's, how did this happen? How does this increase my understanding? Not, am I going to pick this apart to try and see that maybe it didn't happen, like liberal scholars would do. Any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns as we have finished the historical perspective and method on looking at the scriptures? Had a pretty good class tonight. Well,
Not that bad. I didn't like that part.
but it held you right there, didn't it?
The word history says his story.
That's right, it does.
His story.
Absolutely.
Oh, that was a good idea.
Well, we will go ahead and close with a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for allowing us to gather here tonight and to look at the ways that we can take the topic of history into Bible study, and how we can look at the timeline of events and how things happen in a timeline or in a sequence of events, and the individuals involved, and maybe the ways things were done or played, the way things played out or carried out, to just get a deeper level of understanding that there may be more than just this happened, and that there may have been a greater reason for what happened or why it happened, that you had a greater purpose than just some point A to point B, that we can use to study and to gain greater understanding. I ask that you be with those that we mentioned tonight, and be with us as we go our separate ways. We ask this in your Son's holy name. Amen.